Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Southwood Landscape and Garden Center, Tulsa's source for great gardens, southwoodgardencenter.com. And the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, OSU Extension Vegetable Specialist Lynn Brandenberger shows off his cool season vegetables. Host Casey Hinches compares using annual versus perennial plants in the landscape. We have tips on pruning spring blooming shrubs. And Barbara Brown cooks a pineapple chicken fried rice.
We are in the backyard of Dr. Lynn Brandenberger, who is our extension vegetable specialist. And Dr. Brandenberger, you've got quite a few cool season leafy greens growing here. Can you talk to us about them, please?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question. Yeah, leafy greens are a great set of crops to grow when it's cool. So actually we can start in mid to late August. Once that first front goes through, we can seed then and get them up and grow them. We can also grow them later in the fall and on clear through the winter. We can come back again in the spring if we want to. Different
types, right? Yeah. I mean, like, so spinach, you started some spinach down here on the end. You started that in August of last season, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And then you also just recently started some in, when were these started here? The smaller ones.
Most of the rest of them were direct seeded back in January, which is probably a little bit early, but you know, they eventually came up.
So you kind of have a succession crop growing here.
Yeah, a little bit.
All right, so we can harvest our larger spinach and still get some of our baby. We truly are growing baby spinach here.
Yeah.
So what else do you have? You've got some collards and some Swiss chard, it looks like, as well?
Yeah, we've got... we also have some leaf lettuce,
the red,
right down here with the red leaf lettuce. That was just too pretty not to bring home and stick in the garden.
I was going to say, with this red leaf lettuce, and then you've got the Swiss chard here with its colorful stems. Is there a favorite of yours, or what do you like to do with all of this?
Well, you could, except for the lettuce, we could cook all of it. And a lot of times it's a great idea as far as nutritional wise to mix greens because they don't all have the same levels of nutrients. So like spinach might have a lot of, say, calcium, but it doesn't have as much iron as something else. So you substitute or bring in another crop, throw it in there in the pot, and then you bring that level of that nutrient up that the other crop might have been a little low on. So.
And how do we find out about the nutrition levels of different crops that we might have?
Well, actually USDA has a website that you can go to that lists all the nutrient levels of a lot of different things. I mean, you can look up Twinkies, you can look up spinach, you can look up all these different crops and find out what levels of nutrients, in other words, vitamins and minerals that they would have.
Oh, very good. So you've got your collards here too, which are a little bit of a lighter colored green with a white stem to them. So the nice thing about all of your leafy greens here is they look pretty healthy. You don't have too many pest problems with cool season crops.
A lot of the pests that we have trouble with in the summer garden, we don't have so much trouble with in the winter garden. So we don't have a lot of grasshoppers, you know, things like that. A lot of the chewing insects, except for we can have cabbage looper, which just loves collard and pak choy and that brassica group, and we might have some aphid issues.
Okay.
To be honest with you, we have not sprayed anything this year at all.
Oh, okay. Fantastic.
So we haven't even put out BT.
All right, which is an organic bacteria that controls cabbage loopers, right? Exactly. So Dr. Brandenberger, would you say that cool season crops are a little bit easier to grow than warm season crops?
Well, we talked a little bit about the pests, and there seem to be fewer pests that we have to deal with. But the nice thing about leafy crops is we're just growing leaf tissue. So we do not have to get it to flower. We don't have to get it to set fruit or mature the fruit. We're just growing leaf tissue. So it's a lot less problematic. We have a lot fewer problems with it.
All right. So one of my questions is, a lot of these are some of the leafy greens that you can just harvest the leaves as you want them. Pak choi is one that maybe some people aren't familiar with. What's the way you go about harvesting that? Do you eat it as a leafy green, or do you eat it as like maybe a head lettuce?
You could eat it any way you want. Normally what you do with pak choi though is you cut just under the base of the plant. So you take the entire plant at once.
Okay.
And then it can be sliced up and stir fried. You could use it in salads. You could boil it like you would any other greens crop.
All right.
So it has quite a bit of nutrients in it. So it's
yeah,
a good one.
Definitely add that to your salad mix and enjoy. Dr. Brandenburger, thank you for inviting us to your backyard to see your cool season crop.
Well, we're glad you came today and hope you'll come back another time.
It's time to head to the nursery, and you might be looking for either annuals, perennials, or perhaps both. But what is the difference between an annual and a perennial? An annual completes its life cycle in one growing season. That means it's going to germinate, grow vegetation, flower, produce a seed, and then die all within 1 year. So why would you buy a plant that you know is going to die? Well, you see, we really like annuals because they provide us with consistent color from the time we plant them out to the garden to the time they die later on in the season. In fact, we often reference annuals as the color in the garden or bedding plants. Annuals tend to be a little bit cheaper than perennials because you have to buy them and replant them every season. Now, a lot of times when we reference annuals, we're referring to warm season annuals, such as zinnias and marigolds. We can plant them out in the garden after the last concern of frost, usually around mid-April, and they'll continue to provide that color to us into the fall. There are, however, cool season annuals such as sweet alyssum and pansies. These can be planted in the fall or in the spring to provide you that color. Perennials are plants that live longer than 2 years, hopefully anyway. They may reproduce a seed every year, or it may take several years for them to reproduce. But you know that they're going to come back year after year. So they're an investment in your garden. Now, perennials don't typically bloom quite as long as our annuals do. So you have to know a little bit more about perennials. They'll continue to reproduce, so this allows you to divide them and incorporate them in other places of your garden or share them with your friends. Now notice we defined annuals and perennials based off of their life cycle, not based off of their hardiness. And sometimes if we do use the word perennial based off of hardiness, this can be misleading and confusing. A perennial in Texas may not mean that it's going to return for us here in Oklahoma where it's a little bit cooler. To identify a plant's hardiness, you really want to refer to the USDA Cold Hardiness Map. This map divides the U.S. into 26 zones based off of the average coldest temperatures. Plants are assigned a cold hardiness number based off of its ability to tolerate the cold winter months. In Oklahoma, we go from a hardiness zone of 8A down in the far southeast corner of the state, where the average cold temperature is between 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, to 6A in the far northwest corner of the state, where the average cold temperature is -5 to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Therefore, plants that may be hardy in southeastern Oklahoma may not survive in northwest Oklahoma. To ensure that you're getting a truly hardy plant, find one that is hardy below the number of your given location to better ensure its survivability. For example, most of the middle of Oklahoma, including Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and Stillwater, is Zone 7A. If we buy plants that are hardy to 5 or 6, we know that they should be easily able to survive even the coldest Oklahoma winters. Now keep in mind, this map is just referencing the average coldest temperatures, and there's many other factors that can influence a plant's hardiness, such as the moisture and the sun exposure. So to recap, annuals are plants that complete their life cycle in 1 year. They tend to be a little bit cheaper, but they'll provide us with color throughout the growing season. perennials are plants that typically live at least 2 years or longer. Now, they don't bloom quite as often or quite as long as annuals, but they allow us to discover something new in our garden throughout the growing season. Keep in mind, however, that a perennial will only truly return if it's hardy to your zone according to the USDA zone map. Whether you had a quince, lilac, forsythia, or azalea recently bloom in your garden, it might be time to consider pruning it. Now is the time that we prune spring flowering shrubs just as those flowers are starting to fade. The reason why we prune spring flowering shrubs after they bloom is because they bloom on what is called old wood, or last season's growth. So as we go into this growing season, they're going to start to develop those flower buds for next spring. And we want to make sure that we prune them back before those flower buds develop. Otherwise, we're sacrificing our flowers for next season. So why do we prune shrubs? A lot of times we prune shrubs to maintain the size that they are. And we have to keep in mind with spring flowering shrubs, we're going into the growing season. So unless they've already reached their mature size, they're only going to get larger for us. So if we are satisfied with the size that they are now, we still might want to consider pruning them back just a little bit so again they can continue growing bigger this summer. If you're new to pruning, it can be a little intimidating as to where to make that first cut. You might be afraid that you're going to make the wrong cut or perhaps kill the plant altogether. But there's a few things that you should look at or consider that will help kind of guide you through this process, no matter what you're pruning. The first thing that you want to consider is taking away any dead wood that you might find in that shrub. The dead wood is not adding, of course, to the aesthetics of the plant at all, and it's really not adding to the overall health of the plant. It's not providing any photosynthesis or anything. And in fact, that dead wood can be more detrimental to the overall plant health because it increases the amount of decay around the plant, which sometimes serves as an invitation to insects and diseases. So we're going to remove some of this dead wood that we find down here at the base of this plant. And we're just going to use our hand pruners to get some of the smaller stuff, and then we'll use our larger loppers if we have bigger stuff we need to remove. Now, you may have a plant that has a lot of dead tissue in it, and that's okay. You still want to make sure to remove all of that dead tissue because that just leads to decay within the healthy part of the plant. Now, keep in mind, if you do remove a lot of dead wood from that plant is not at its healthiest for whatever reason. Now, the next thing that you want to do is step back away from the plant and consider the size of the plant that it is now, the living portion of that plant. You never want to remove more than a third of what is remaining of the living tissue. If you cut more than a third of a plant back, it just kind of sends that plant into a tailspin a little bit. You've removed more than a third of the foliage, which creates photosynthesis that helps that plant survive. Also, the plant's used to taking up so much water, and it will have that as excess. So we never want to remove more than a third of the live plant. By stepping back and evaluating the size of it, kind of look at what a third of it would be if you were to remove it. Once you've determined and kind of taken a look at it as to how big it is, then you're going to take a look at the health of the plant that's remaining and see if you can find any diseased or insect damage to the plant. You want to make sure to check all aspects of the plant because insects and disease can be anywhere. It can be on the branches, especially the leaves or the underneath side of the leaves and the new growth. Now, if you've identified just a couple of branches that might be infested, then go ahead and clip out those infested branches. If you notice that the disease or the insects is kind of overall on the whole entire plant, then of course we're not going to prune the whole plant back, but you might at that point want to consider treating it. If you still just prune a couple of branches that might have been infested, then it wouldn't be a bad idea to still consider treating it. A lot of times when we find insects or disease somewhere, there's likely more that we're not seeing as well. But by removing it mechanically, you're just getting a little bit of a head start on any problems in the future. So after you have removed any insect or disease damage, the next thing to look at is for any rubbing branches. So down here we have a couple of branches, about 3 branches actually, that are rubbing against each other. So this one that is outward of the plant, and then these 2 that tend to go back towards the center of the plant, and they're all rubbing right here. So how do you decide which one to remove? Well, one, you want to look at and see if there's any actual open wounds on any of them, and the one that has the worst damage would obviously be one to consider removing. The other thing is, again, the direction of those branches and how they'll continue to grow. So these 2 branches are the smaller of the 2, and they're both, again, growing towards the center of the plant, which isn't as preferred as growing out and more open. So we're going to leave this one and take out these 2. And by removing these 2 branches, we'll eliminate the problem of them rubbing on that larger branch. If we had left them, they would again continue to wear on that branch, again creating an open wound that would invite insects and disease into our plant. After pruning for any infestation and also rubbing branches, you once again want to step back away from the shrub and see how the size is looking, and you want to make sure not to remove more than 1/3. So if you still have some more room to prune, then you're going to start pruning for aesthetics and size reduction. Now, if you removed a lot of infested branches or rubbing branches, then at this point you might want to hold off on pruning just for aesthetic purposes or size reduction. In that case, what you're going to have to do is give it another year to grow back out, go through that checklist again, in which case you'll likely be able to go through it faster and not remove as much for infestation and for rubbing branches. And you'll be able to then prune for aesthetics. So we didn't have to prune too much for insects or disease, so we can now go into size reduction. So the first thing too you want to do is look at the crown of the plant. A lot of times spring flowering shrubs benefit from a rejuvenation, and so we might want to look at removing any older branches down in the crown of the plant. Again, you want to think about the canopy of the shrub and make sure you have an open kind of central area to allow for good airflow. Airflow is critical in preventing diseases and insects. And so you can see we've got a little bit of open area here because of some previous pruning that we've done. We've got some height over here that's kind of getting into our birch tree. So we're going to reduce this just a little bit. Now, when you prune for size reduction, you want to look at the buds and make sure that you're pruning again to an outward facing bud. That will give you an idea of where that branch is going to continue to grow. So if we prune just above this node right here, this branch is going to continue to grow this way, which would grow inward. If we prune here, it will grow outward away from the center of the canopy. So we're going to take this down to just right about here. Again, we have a lot of tissue here, and so we're going to take this down just a little bit as well. I think we're going to start with this outside branch and remove some of it. Again, keeping in mind that we're going into the growing season for spring plants, so these plants will flush out and cover over any of this pruned pretty quickly. When you're pruning, of course, aesthetics is important, and we want to make sure that we still, again, step back and take a look at the plant, because at this point, we're comfortable with making cuts on a shrub. It is a little bit like a haircut, and you want to make sure that you don't take too much off, because there's no going back. You're just going to have to wait for it to grow out a little bit to look better. But stepping back, making sure that you've got a good form as you cut and not taking too much from one side is also important to the aesthetics. So these are the basics when pruning. Again, first of all, remove any dead, and then after that, look at it to see how much a third of the plant is to remove. You're going to first start by removing any diseased or infested plant material. Next, you're going to look at any rubbing plant material, and then finally, you're going to then prune for aesthetics and size reduction. So even though those spring flowering shrubs may be done with their colorful display, don't forget to take one last look at them before we head into summertime. For more information about pruning, check out this fact sheet.
Today we're doing pineapple chicken fried rice. Now that sounds like it might be highly involved, but fried rice by design is basically something that's going to cook fairly quickly. So once you get all the chopping and the cutting, you're ready to go. The other nice thing about fried rice is that it's an excellent way to use leftovers, which is what I'm doing today. So I've got a wok here. You could use a big skillet or an electric skillet or just a regular one on a stovetop. I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of canola oil, peanut oil, pretty much whatever oil you happen to have on hand that's a cooking oil. And then to that also 1 tablespoon of sesame oil because I want some extra flavor in there. Now the pan should be fairly hot already, so I'm going to hope for the best and stir in a little bit of this. It could be a little bit hotter, make the oil a little bit hotter so that it doesn't absorb so much of the fat into the onion itself. I've got a cup of onion, which is about half of a fairly large onion. Again, like a salad or a soup, ingredients can be more what you happen to have on hand than what the recipe calls for. This is one where you do want it to be fairly chopped fairly evenly and fairly small as well, as opposed to some other things where it can be in larger pieces. We're going to add that to our skillet and hopefully get this up where the heat is a little bit higher fairly quickly. And then to this also, I'm going to add 2 cloves of garlic and get all these in at the same time. And 1½ cups of pineapple. Now I used fresh pineapple because fall is the season when fresh pineapple is available. And so I wanted to get the most flavor I could from it. You could use canned pineapple, probably not crushed, but you could use tidbits or you could use cubed pineapple rings and just cut them into a little bit smaller pieces. The next ingredient that I have here is one that's a little less common for us in the States, at least in the 48 contiguous states. This is called 5-spice powder, and it's basically kind of like chili powder. It's a blend. And so you have star anise in here, you've got a little cinnamon, you've got some cloves, you've got ginger, all of those mixed in. And you could use those individually. I used a tablespoon, and to buy each of those in order to get the right mix, you'd spend a lot more than if you just went ahead and got the 5-spice powder. This we're going to let stir fry until the onion has softened up and starts to turn a little bit golden. The pineapple is also going to cook down a little bit, and some of the rawness is also going to cook out of that 5-spice powder. Now when that's got our 5 to 6 to 8 minutes in here, we'll go ahead and add 2 or 3 more ingredients. The third one is optional. All right, this is cooked up nicely. You can see the onion has become a lot more tender. And I told you a misstatement, or I provided you a misstatement. We have 3 more required ingredients. The first one is 2 to 3 cups of fresh spinach. Now, if you're a family that doesn't like greens like this, you could use fresh or frozen peas or asparagus or some other green vegetable to add a lot of color to it as well. Stir that in and let it start to wilt. And then I'm going to stir in 2 cups of rice. Now this is rice that is cold, and rice that has been cooked ahead and chilled down works much, much better on stir fry than does rice that you cook and use immediately. That chilling down allows it to become more separate, allows it to start to gel a little bit on each of the rice kernels so that you get a much better product if you've done that ahead. And the last thing is somewhere between 2 to 3 cups of chicken. Now this is just chicken that I bought at the market, and then put it in a little bit of water and cooked it until it was up to 165, chilled it down, and went from there. But I did use the water from cooking the chicken yesterday to cook the rice in, so that enabled me to maintain those nutrients that way. This is all there is to this. This is something you're going to let cook long enough until it's heated through. That'll usually take 2 to 3 minutes, so you can see that this becomes a very fast cook. I'm going to go ahead and at least assume that that's cooked through. This is going to go on plates, and then you challenge your family to eat with chopsticks, but this becomes a complete meal because you have all the components that you're going to need. Now, one of the things, this is the optional ingredient that you may want to use, is a little bit of soy sauce, either regular or reduced sodium soy sauce over the top of that. Gives it a nice finishing touch. I hope you'll give this one a try. It's pineapple chicken fried rice. For Oklahoma Gardening, I'm Barbara Brown.
There are lots of great horticultural events this time of year. Be sure and consider these activities when you're making your plans for the weeks ahead. Next week, we find out how to safely store our household chemicals. And we have a handy how-to for irrigating a group of pots. So join us then for more TV You'll Grow to Love. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We wish to thank our generous underwriters, Southwood Landscape and Garden Center, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is provided by Pond Pro Shops, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, and the Oklahoma Horticultural Society.